Welcome. I'm Tracey Spicer and welcome to One Just World. Have any of you been to one of these public forums before for One Just World? Put your hands up. Oh, terrific. Well, welcome back. As you know, it's a tremendous night, and for those of you who haven't been here before, it's just extraordinary. You'll walk out of here with a lot of knowledge on board, but also a really great feeling that things are being done and we can all help. For those of you who don't know, One Just World, it's an initiative sponsored by the government's International Development Agency, AusAid, in partnership with the International Women's Development Agency and World Vision Australia, of which I'm a proud ambassador. Tonight, these organisations are partnered with the University of Sydney, Plan Australia and UNICEF Australia. Our discussion tonight is on Empower a Girl, Change the World, which is a topic that I personally am extremely passionate about. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we stand and acknowledge their elders past and present. We believe that respecting the rights and the contributions of Indigenous peoples is an integral part of international development. We'll talk a lot about that tonight. One Just World provides a platform for ideas and discussion around important development and human rights issues to enable you, the audience, to question people directly involved, like these lovely ladies on my left, and find ways that you can help those in need. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please put your mobile phones on silent. We'd like you to keep your mobiles with you though, because we'd love you to tweet about this or Facebook about it. The Twitter hashtag is OneJW, and if you're looking for Wi-Fi connectivity, there's a sheet that was on your seat when you sat down that'll give you the password to get into the Seymour Centre's connectivity for Wi-Fi. Now, for those of you who'll be tweeting, and you don't even get this on Q&A, this is pretty good, there's a prize of a $50 iTunes voucher donated by a One World supporter for the best tweet. How good is that? As I mentioned, tonight we're fortunate to have four esteemed guests on the panel. I've just been chatting to these ladies. I can't wait for you to hear what they've got to say. They're all fascinating, engaging characters with extraordinary experience in international development around the world. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Penny Williams on my far left, your far right. Penny is Australia's first ever Global Ambassador for Women and Girls. And isn't it terrific that Australia has a Global Ambassador like that? She's responsible for high-level advocacy to promote Australian government policies and activity regarding gender equality and the social, political and economic empowerment of women and girls, particularly in the Asia-Pacific. Prior to this appointment 12 months ago, Penny served as Australia's High Commissioner to Malaysia and has held a number of senior positions in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as well as diplomatic appointments in Chile and Syria. Penny holds a Bachelor of Arts in Asian Studies from the Australian National University. Please welcome Penny. Now, right next to me we have Karen Allen. Karen is the Deputy Representative at UNICEF in Pakistan. In this role, she coordinates emergency recovery and development programs for children in the areas of health, nutrition, water, sanitation and hygiene, education and protection. What an extraordinarily huge job, as you can well imagine. These programs target the poorest of the poorest, children and families, with special emphasis on ending gender-based discrimination against girls. Prior to moving to Pakistan in 2008, Karen was UNICEF's Deputy Representative in Uganda and Regional Program Planning Chief for Eastern and Southern Africa. Karen is an American who spent much of her life in developing countries, in fact most of her adult life, fulfilling her passion and commitment to bring hope and help to women and children. Please welcome Karen. Our next panellist, some of you may well know her, Dr. Elizabeth Cassity. Elizabeth is a lecturer in the Faculty of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. She spent her academic career in the field of comparative and international education and has lived and worked in a number of countries around the world. Elizabeth was a teacher and project director with a women's literacy project in northern Namibia, conducted PhD fieldwork in Fiji, and has recently examined bilateral education policy in Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia and the Philippines. She's also conducted research on equity and cultural diversity with young people in schools in Western Sydney and Brazil. Please welcome Elizabeth. Last but most certainly not least is our youngest panellist, and we're so thrilled to have her here today, Maddie Gould. Now, Maddie is a member of Youth Planning a Change Today, which is Plan Australia's youth team. Maddie is passionate, so passionate, wait till you hear her talk, about empowering girls because she believes girls are of incredible value and should be considered and treated equally. When she leaves school, Maddie wants a career in the medical field and to work in developing countries. She believes the most important thing we can do individually for change is to stand up against the injustices that we see every day. Maddie. Now tonight, in recognition of the very first ever International Day of the Girl Child on October 11, we'll be exploring the opportunities that girls present to the world as well as the challenges that they face. We'll start with a half-hour panel discussion, and following that, we'll take some questions from the audience. So we'll be talking for half an hour, and then we'd love to hear what you'd like to ask of these extraordinary women. The theme for the Day of the Girl Child is to end child marriage. Believe it or not, and I must say I almost fell off my chair when I read these figures a couple of days ago, 10 million girls every year are forced into marriage, severely limiting their opportunities, as you can well imagine. They're denied the right to a childhood, had their education disrupted or stopped altogether, and also have their health jeopardised, particularly if the marriage leads to teenage pregnancy, the biggest killer of 15 to 19-year-olds. I mean, that is just abominable. But child marriage is just one of the many issues facing girls in developing countries. The loss of education has a major impact on a girl's ability to succeed later in life, and we'll ask Elizabeth about that later. Education is such a transformative thing, as you all know. Girls are often forced to stay at home or go out and earn money while boys continue at school. I had the great privilege of visiting a girls' school 9 hours out of Dhaka in Bangladesh with World Vision about 15 years ago. And it was extraordinary to see this school full of girls with uniforms on and a blackboard there and a curriculum and books. In this village, girls had never been educated before this school was set up 15 years ago. So things are changing, but it really is quite horrifying. According to the World Bank, there are 35 million girls who should be in school who are not. The potential of a girl, if she continues her education, is staggering. It not only helps her future, it helps her family, her entire community. With women reinvesting 90% of their earnings back into their families, while men reinvest around 30 to 40%, the education of girls could make a huge difference to the reduction of global poverty. In fact, 65 low and middle income countries lose approximately $92 billion every year by failing to educate their girls. But the news isn't all bad. In recent decades, there's been significant progress towards improving education for those in the developing world. Unfortunately, despite the great progress, there are still many children out of school. So what can we do to improve the situation faced by girls? How do we ensure they get a proper education? How do we stop this increasing tide of child marriage? And what about the other problems? Trafficking, selling and slavery of girls is rampant. Girls have a number of serious health concerns, many suffering malnutrition because the boys are fed first, not to mention the impacts of war, disaster and domestic violence. And what about the number of girls that never get a chance? What about the so-called gendercide happening around the world simply because their parents wanted a boy instead of a girl? How do we help so many girls reach their full potential? This is what tonight is all about. And fortunately, I'm the one asking the questions, not answering them. It's a big challenge. So first of all, Karen, you live and work in a country with a tremendous amount of poverty. I mentioned some of the obstacles there. What are the main obstacles that girls in Pakistan face?
Tracey, I think it's important to understand why all of these things happen. And in most cases, the families that UNICEF works with in remote rural areas, in urban slums, it's not because they don't love their daughters. They do. It's because they themselves live in extreme, abject poverty, the kind of poverty that we can scarcely imagine. The kind of poverty where a father every day is trying to figure out, can I even get a few calories into the mouths of everyone in this household? So the socioeconomic disparities, injustices, and inequalities, the whole socioeconomic structure needs to be changed to give opportunities to boys and girls. So every day, parents are making really, really difficult decisions, and to them, it doesn't even feel like a decision. It feels like they have no choice. If a son is the only one that's going to be able to go out and earn a living, they invest in that boy. And that kind of root cause has to change. It's not always in the power of the parents to make that choice.
There are so many issues on so many levels, Sarah. I want to get back to all of those in the next half hour. I'd like to speak to each of you first, though. Penny, tell us about what the Australian government is doing and governments are doing to help women and girls in the Pacific region.
Thanks, Tracey. My role, although global, really Asia-Pacific, but I've been really focused in the Pacific since the position was created as a diplomatic position 12 months ago. And the reason for that is not just because it's our neighbourhood, but because the situation of women and girls in the Pacific is so dire. The Pacific has some of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world. In some countries, around 70% of women and girls have experienced violence. And some of that's quite horrific violence. And the rates of female participation in politics is the lowest in the world. We've just seen some women elected in PNG to the parliament, which is amazing and historic. But in fact, there's only 5% of parliamentarians in the Pacific are women. I mean, that's incredibly low. So the government is really focused on how we can use girls, how we can work with women to change that. And I was very lucky to be able to attend the Pacific Island Forum 2 weeks ago, where firstly, the Pacific Island leaders themselves made a political commitment to the empowerment of women and girls, including potentially using temporary and special measures, quotas, I suppose, or targets to increase representation in policy. And then the Australian government, were able to make, or the Prime Minister announced $320 million. And the thing that's so important about that $320 million is that it's over 10 years. And for any of you who've worked for government, you know that governments tend not to promise 10 years in advance. And that's the recognition that it's about generational change. You can't just have a 3-year project and think that the world's going to change. So you really need to do it over a long term because you need to work with the girls. So it addresses at once political empowerment, economic empowerment, safety, recognises education as underpinning foundation, and it recognises social change, so attitudinal change on men, girls, boys and women as a sort of underpinning. So really that's going to be it's a sort of a flagship program, I suppose, for the aid program that recognises that you have to tackle the problem starting with girls through generational change. So quite exciting.
You're coming from such a low base there, aren't you? I remember being shocked when the Prime Minister said, and you've just reiterated, the low number of women, particularly in politics in the Pacific. So I think it's a terrific initiative. So we'll extrapolate on that later too. Maddie, you're a girl living in a developed country, in one of the richest countries in the world. Why do you think it's important for girls to be empowered, not just here, but right around the world?
Thanks, Tracey. I think it's so important for girls to be empowered because they are the key to stopping intergenerational poverty. I was reading an article by the Because I'm a Girl campaign and was taken back by some pretty massive and disturbing statistics. Some of these included, across the globe, 75 million girls don't have access to or aren't allowed to go to school. And one you've mentioned earlier, the biggest killer of 15 to 19-year-old girls is pregnancy. But then I scrolled to the bottom of the page, and what I saw really excited me. It said, the global solution. And the global solution is empowering girls in developing countries. And like this forum's called, Empower a Girl, Change the World. Not only, though, is it important to empower girls in developing countries, but here in Australia also. And when I was a young girl, I wanted to read you a story. It's called, I Wanted to Change the World. When I was a young girl, I wanted to change the world. I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my nation. When I found I could not change my nation, I began to focus on my town. I couldn't change my town, and as an older woman, I tried to change my family. Now, as an old lady, I realize the only thing I can change is myself. And suddenly I realized that if long ago I had changed myself, I could have made an impact on my family. My family could have had an impact on our town, and their impact could have changed the nation, and I could have indeed changed the world. And I think the point of this story is really applicable today. If we want to see change in the world, we need to realize the potential and impact we as individuals have. If we all, as individuals, change ourselves, fight for a solution, and stand up, then you'll soon see that, like the lady in the story, your small change will make a big change.
Such wise words. You're an inspiration, Maddie. You're making a very big difference. Good on you. Another figure that jumped out at me, Elizabeth, speaking about on the back of some of the figures that Maddie just mentioned there, is that an extra year of secondary education could increase a girl's future income by 10 to 20%. I know we talk about it all the time, but just how important is it to educate girls?
Well, Tracey, I can answer in the affirmative. It's a good education for girls is absolutely critical for girls' empowerment. And I should qualify, that's a quality education. That's an education that's relevant. We talk a lot about access and we talk a lot about enrollment, but that's not really addressing those issues of quality. What is it that keeps girls, especially in school? Some of the benefits, investing in girls' education has been cited as an economic driver for a country. The promotion of girls' education is seen as a strategy to help girls who become women enter the workforce, earn an income. And as well, girls that complete secondary education have the option to go on to tertiary education, participate in vocational technical education, or go into the workforce. Also in health, I mean, what we know, with increased years of completion in secondary schooling, there's improved factors on reduction in maternal mortality. There's also lowered fertility rates of women, and also more knowledge of women in families about family health issues. So some real benefits there. And we also, from a rights-based approach, women learning more strategies that include girls and women in education actually have the potential to change attitudes and practices that might, in the long term, remove barriers to girls and women actually accessing education. I think it is really important, though, in thinking about girls, to also think about women and how women fit into those policies, how women can be role models. And what we definitely know from research is that having a woman teacher or even a female teacher's aide in the classroom encourages girls to stay in school. It makes classrooms feel like more safe places, more interesting places for girls to be. So that's a really those women role models, women teachers, very important in retaining girls in education, and especially in girls' education. So I've mentioned a lot of the positives, the big dreams about education. But and I think as Karen mentioned, there's a number of things that we struggle with. Poverty is the most important correlate in the reason that girls are excluded from education, and boys as well. The cost of secondary schooling. Gosh, secondary schooling is pretty unevenly distributed throughout the world. It costs more money. It can be a cost to families. And so poor families, it can be a burden. So we have a lot of hope in secondary education. It certainly can increase these tangibles like economic participation, health, and sort of initial enabling rights, and the enabling rights of education for women. But there's one thing I wanted to add. There's also, I guess we could call it an intangible of education. A few years ago, I interviewed a woman who was a director of a non-government organization in Vanuatu. And she was one of the first women to complete a full course of secondary education. So this would have been like late 60s, early 70s. So she was quite a unique person. But she said, Elizabeth, it just changed my thinking. There was something about secondary education. So it's an ideal, but boy, we have a lot of challenges in terms of of one getting girls access to schools, but then helping them stay in schools as well.
There are so many challenges here. I'd just like to ask you, first of all, Karen, and then you, secondly, Penny, about some anecdotes, some experiences, speaking to people, Karen, in Pakistan, speaking to families. What kind of things do they say to you about why their girl can't go to school? Do they express it as explicitly as, look, we simply can't afford it, or the girl is worth less? What kind of words do they use to describe that to you?
Things are really changing in Pakistan, and I believe in South Asia and the world too, compared to when I got into this field 35 years ago. 35 years ago, in rural areas especially, people didn't even know often what a school was. And it was, if they had heard of schools, it was something that's for other people, richer people, not for us. Now, everywhere I go, even the most remote areas, even where the whole village is illiterate, they know about school, they want it. They want school for their children. They want a better life for their children. I've been in a lot of focus group discussions where we just sit on the floor in someone's hut, and of course, through a translator in my case, we get the women to talk about their lives and their dreams. And I always ask the same question everywhere in the world at some point, and that is, if you could have one thing for your daughter that you didn't have for yourself, what would that be? Now, unlike in other countries, the only answer I get to that in every village in Pakistan is school. And the whole group of women will say it together, school, school. Now, when access, as Penny said, and attitude change and quality are all important, but for the most of the millions of out-of-school children in Pakistan, we don't even have the basics of access, but now we have the attitude change. And I've also talked to women and mothers and fathers, and even a few grandmothers, who said, oh, you know, when I was young, we didn't know that school was a thing for girls. We thought school was a thing for boys and home was a thing for girls. But now we understand that's not the case, and that girls can go to school. So could you please help us in our village have a school where girls can go? Now, when they say have a girls' wear school to go, it's a traditional culture, and they're not talking about mixed education and co-ed education. And they're very, very worried that that school should have a boundary wall so that passers-by, especially men, can't look in and scope out their daughters. They're very worried that there should be a female teacher and that that female teacher should not be beating their daughters. Basic fundamental things. We want a boundary wall, and we want a female teacher who won't beat our daughters. So the attitude shift is there, but we need to work on the poverty question and the access, first of all.
That's a significant step forward, though, isn't it, in one generation? Penny, what's the attitude to educating girls across the Pacific?
I mean, in the Pacific, actually, we've seen some success in terms of the number of girls in school, but the points about safety are still something that people raise all the time, men and women, about their daughters, as something that could potentially restrict access, and also, I must say, to marketplaces for women as well. So there are these concerns about keeping people safe. But you actually see a success story relative to some of the other areas around education, and I think that's really important. I must say that there's some really fantastic positive things, because it's good to hear a positive story as well. I've been lucky to meet young women, girls and young women from the Pacific who are involved in organisations that are promoting leadership, and they are some of the most dynamic, driven young people who you could ever come across. So you also have that sense of that there is a sort of potential a future leadership there who's really kind of driving change for themselves, and that we, I suppose, have to make sure, and people in their communities, make sure that that's encouraged and strengthened, and that we mentor them. So all these issues about access are the same, obviously, particularly in rural and remote parts of the Pacific sort of confront girls, that they have pretty good, girls and boys have the same access rates, which is really good. There's issues around violence and safety, but I guess I always want to keep reminding ourselves that there's actually some fantastic young women and girls in the Pacific as well, and we really need to help them and work with them and let them tell us what we need to do.
Because they're fantastic role models then as well, aren't they? Maddie, how important is it for young people, young girls, to be empowered, to have these role models from a very young age?
Yeah, empowerment at a young age can really set you on the right path. My family always taught me the importance of perseverance and equality. And I think this has had a massive impact on my life. I mean, I'm 15 sitting here talking to all of you.
Wow, that is impressive.
Living in a stable household is really important in determining how a child grows up and what decisions they make when they're older. Helping families now to teach and empower their children, especially girls, is invaluable.
Brilliant. Every time you speak, I feel like actually clapping. Frankly, you're amazing. When I was 15, there's no way I could have sat in front of all these people and done this, so that's absolutely extraordinary. Something that's not often spoken of, and I do want to dissect this a little bit, is, you know, are we being cultural imperialists, right? Are we going into these countries and imposing our values and our will on them? We know that there's a great outcome for it. How difficult is it confronting the cultural challenges, and how do you, to a degree, overcome that? Anybody?
I'll take a shot.
I'm happy to have a go too.
It's a big question.
My mother was a homemaker who only went to work because the family needed another income stream. You know, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, they didn't go out to work. My great-grandmothers wore big hoop skirts. I think all of our great-grandmothers did. That was the culture. But look how we've changed. So I think it's really important to unpack what is culture and what are the valuable good things that should be maintained in the culture, and what are harmful traditional practices or lack of choice, and not call that culture. Because if people want to change and they see the value of changing, they'll happily leave that kind of behavior behind.
I would follow that up. I think, I guess it's important as well that culture is actually not something fixed. We don't simply have traditional and modern and people don't change. And so I think that people actually do change. And Penny brought up sort of an interesting point. She talked about working with people, working with women. And I think that sort of spirit of partnership with, if you will, or the idea of working with other people and learning from other people is certainly a way forward in terms of change. It does take a long time, but I think it does happen.
Picking up on that, what I would say, and I think this is the approach with the Pacific, if you think about how did the status of women improve in Australia, it wasn't necessarily because governments decided to do it because it was the right thing to do. It was driven by the women's movement. And there's a women's movement in the Pacific. There's a women's movement in Pakistan. And it's really important to strengthen and empower those women so that they can drive that change at the same time as having conversations with government. And in my role, it's an ambassadorial role, so I engage with senior government officials. Now, I can't always make the rights case. I can't always make the moral case because I'll get it's our culture, it's custom. But you can often make an economic case. And the same in Australia, you know, how did people get childcare? Well, people made the economic case, or maternity leave. It was built on the economic case. Well, we know that there's sort of moral reasons for it. But, you know, I also, I suppose, in my role would also at times draw on the economic case. And I do think that when Pacific Island leaders signed a declaration, when they came up with that declaration a couple of weeks ago, I think what drove them particularly was the need to develop their countries, and that they could see that if they were not including 50% of the population fully in developing their countries, then they weren't going to achieve that. So I don't think it's necessarily as stark as sort of this cultural imperial going in and telling people what to do. You need to listen to the people themselves, work with them. I don't think we would have gone in and announced a big package for the Pacific if it were not for the policy commitment by leaders. The two need to go hand in hand.
Can I tell a story here from Bangladesh? Sure. I was working in Bangladesh in the late 80s and early 1990s on a family planning program. And people in the late 80s, especially the men, were saying, family planning will never work here. It is against our culture. And then we said, we think that it can work. And look at this example from a place called Motlop, where since the 1970s, we've had female community health workers moving around in different villages. I went down and interviewed some of those women, and they told me, oh yes, when we started in the late 70s, people would throw rocks at us. They would call us terrible bad names, but we persisted, and they persisted for two reasons. One, they universally said, I knew this was the right thing for myself and my sisters and my neighbors. And they also said, my family needed the money that came from this job. So my husband or my father gave me permission to do it because we were desperate. Now, when I got there in the late 80s and early 90s, those women had become role models. And parents, fathers, were sending their daughters to school so that they too could become a community health worker. And so something that people said, this is against our tradition, it changed that fast in less than a generation.
That's a great story. It's inspiring. Maddie, would you like to?
Yeah, I recently went to a forum in Melbourne that was called the Gender Agenda, and I listened to a lady named Lani speak. Now, Lani, from her personal experience, was a girl living in Australia but with an African culture. And it wasn't about picking one or the other, but it was about respecting both. Yeah.
Absolutely right. This story will make you laugh, hopefully. I went to Uganda last year to a region where women had just been given the right to own land. They'd never been given the right. And it was a community campaign that succeeded. And I was speaking to one of the male elders about it. And I said, well, what did the other blokes think when you came up with this idea at the community council, you know, the heads of the tribes? And he said, oh, they all thought I was a hermaphrodite. And he roared with laughter and threw his head back, and I thought, isn't that tremendous? But he said, then now we realise how much this has helped our community because it had empowered the women. There was a reduced incidence of domestic violence. Women were respected more. It was really interesting how it changed the whole culture, and it was great to see that he had a sense of humour about it. How do we make sure that boys aren't forgotten in all this? Because it's great to talk about the empowerment of girls. They do need help to get up to that certain level, but I guess how can boys not be left behind?
I totally agree with what you're saying. Boys are really important in overcoming inequality and generational inequality. And empowerment for them too can be really life-changing. And a lot of people think that women's equality is about women trying to overtake men, but it's not. It's about women trying to get back on par at the same level as men. And when you think about it, boys and men make up around 50% of the population. They need to be included because we need their support and they need ours.
What about you ladies? Have you had any resistance from countries you've worked in from the men, from the boys?
Yeah, lots of resistance. And it's because of fear. And it's because sometimes we do development programs the wrong way, and we do it in a way that makes them fearful of change, that makes them fearful that they're going to lose power, but also makes them fearful for who they regard as their women, because their honor and their pride is that they are the protectors of the women and the girls. And they very much don't think of themselves as discriminating against girls so much as protecting them. So it's really important that when you go in with a behavior change kind of program and with new opportunities, that is presented, as Penny said, as an opportunity for the whole family, for the whole community. And when it is presented that way, and when, as Maddie said, you also have some really good role models, then it's not perceived as a zero-sum game, and it's not perceived as somebody losing honor or shame or the chance at school.
And in fact, it can be a source of pride because it helps the whole community.
I can follow up on that. We had a very a big Pacific forum here at the University of Sydney about a week and a half ago, and we had a large contingent from the Pacific sitting on panels, and I remember talking to a woman, I think she was from Tonga, and because there have been a lot of programs in the Pacific on dealing with domestic violence, and they've for the most part, have focused on the women's role and on educating women. But she just realized that, well, she didn't realize, she was just telling me that men also need to be part of the solution. And she said, so now they're developing programs for men. I mean, she said, it's great, you go home and you have a woman who's very well educated, knows everything about domestic violence, but then her partner comes home and he doesn't have any of that kind of language. So there is that focus, and Penny, you could probably speak more about those programs.
The male advocates is a really big part of what's going on in the Pacific at the moment, driven out of the Vanuatu Women's Centre and Fiji Women's Crisis Centre. So there's training of male advocates right across the Pacific, and this new program recognises the importance of men and boys in that as well. The White Ribbon campaign has been, and we even have our High Commissioners in the Pacific as White Ribbon, but it actually has some resonance, in PNG it's Tough Men Don't Beat Women, that sort of campaign, and it's very mobile phone focused. So the mobile phone companies send those messages around the Tough Men Don't Beat Women on White Ribbon Day. So there's a real sense of momentum around male advocacy. That has its problems at times, so we can't always say that it's about getting the right men. Doing the right things. But I met a guy just after I was appointed. We flew right to the north of Vanuatu to a place called Torba. It's about 2.5 hours light plane ride from Vila. And then we landed on this small landing strip, and a guy had walked, he was a village chief from the other side of the island, and walked about 4 hours to come and tell me that he is a male advocate against violence in his community, in this incredibly remote community. And he came to tell me because it had been so life-changing for him and so hard. Even though he had status, he had found it really hard going, that he felt that actually doing those messages, saying to his friends, saying to other people, don't beat women, it was like he wanted to unload and share how difficult it had been and to get some acknowledgement of the role that he was playing. So there are men doing that. We've also been working really with the police across the Pacific, trying to get those sorts of sense into that. So it really needs to be, in terms of attitudinal change and support, there is not one solution. It needs to be multifaceted.
Yeah, what a fabulous program. I'll open this up to questions in about 5 minutes, so have a think about what you might like to ask these ladies. But in the meantime, I just want to touch on that child marriage issue again. Why are child marriages occurring? Is it on the increase? What countries are worst affected?
I think the countries that are worst affected are the countries where there are the fewest alternatives, again, choices for girls. We have about 760,000 families in Pakistan that have been displaced because of conflict, military operations, militant groups. And then we have 1.7 million Afghan refugees also in Pakistan. These people are really living in dire circumstances under a lot of psychosocial stress. I went to visit some of them a few weeks ago. I went to one of the places that we set up in these camps where women and children have a safe, protected space, get some literacy skills, get some health education, but also just talk and share. And they were telling me about running away. One of the women said, it was like the sky was raining bullets on my home. And it was obviously very traumatic. And in order to kind of move the conversation away from that trauma, I said, has anything good happened to you? Have you been able to accomplish anything good that you feel good about since coming to this camp? And 3 of the women started laughing and smiling, and they pointed to a girl dressed up in very beautiful clothes in the back of the room, and they said, yes, we were able to get her a husband. The girl is 14 years old, and she was really happy and proud to be the center of attention. And when you really look at child marriage, again, a lot of it is driven by economic circumstances and just not seeing a choice. And what you see is your daughter is at risk of being ashamed and unwanted. And that seems like a really terrible thing. And the best thing that you can do as a mother and a grandmother is to find a good husband for her. And then you feel proud that you've accomplished this. Because what else is there? And again, I know we sound like a broken record, but again, it comes down to if that girl had had a chance to go to school, if that girl had had a chance to acquire some vocational skills, if there were jobs for that girl, then the woman and the mother would have been talking about how proud they were that they got her in school rather than that they put her into a marriage.
Gee, that's a difficult thing to tackle, isn't it, when you've got different generations of the family saying that this is a good thing?
I think it's probably also worth making the case before I see some others in the audience who might make it, so I'll get in first. We have to remember that this is just not an issue that affects other countries. We have difficulties with this issue in Australia, that there are girls who go missing from school who are sent away to be married. So, I mean, my sense of that is that sometimes that reinforces the practice if people from the West are sending girls back to sort of developing countries. So it's something that we need to acknowledge ourselves that happens in Australia. There's been quite a lot of publicity around it in the last couple of months. And also the government's looking at legislation, at least on forced and servile marriage, in terms of criminalising it, but it also needs a support network. So it's just worth keeping in mind sometimes those things. It all doesn't just happen over there. Yeah, exactly. We've seen those in terms of charging on female genital mutilation.
Exactly. Maddie, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, we need to start changing the attitudes and practices of people now. Like Penny mentioned before, we can't change the world overnight, but if we start now, then it will be paying off in the next generations.
Great point. Would anyone like to ask a question? We've got 2 microphones here. We don't have a roving microphone tonight, but if you'd like to, or you can call out. I mean, it's got quite good acoustics here. So there's a lady in the middle there, up the back.
Thank you for the panel. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, and I'm this generation of empower girl tech war. I've gone to primary school, high school, and now university. And the question which I'm now having comes from other African women in the 20s is, what's next? Because most of the focus with development is with girls. But now I feel like in Africa we've got highly educated young girls who've benefited from this primary education, secondary school, but they're still not being employed. They're still not achieving, they're still not where we want them to be in politics and companies, etc. What is next? Because it always feels like it's always the girl, and then we forget that they grow up and become women. And how do we get them to where you guys are, and how to lift up places like where I come from?
It's quite interesting that you say that. I actually had lunch today with some women from a range of African countries who are here on AusAid scholarships, undertaking master's degrees, and they were actually selected for leadership awards, which means that they sort of get 6 weeks or 8 weeks intensive leadership training as well before as well as their master's degree. And the lunch was hosted by the Governor General, who I must say is the most amazing advocate for women and girls. She's just amazing. And she said that, of course, she's visited Africa a couple of times. She made a very long visit, and she said for her, since she's taken up the role, the thing that she was most struck by was that how women were the future of Africa, and that how there were all these women, like you say, in waiting, that they're ready to go and they're ready to jump into political positions and key positions. And some are starting to, but I can sort of understand that frustration when it's almost there and you can almost touch it, I suppose. But my sense is, from what people were saying today, was that it is actually starting to happen in terms of the number of women being elected in politics, for example.
Karen, what about your experiences in Uganda? So you bring up an excellent point that there are a lot of more women that are becoming educated. How do you get them to the next step?
I think young women in secondary school and in college need to be specifically targeted and, as Penny said, enrolled in leadership programs, whether it's through school clubs or college clubs or specific leadership programs. You can't just hope that it will happen naturally. There has to be deliberate efforts to really nurture that and nurture those young women. Secondly, we need to work on strengthening either policies or compliance with the policies on gender-based discrimination in the workplace. And most African countries, and I think I've worked in almost 20 of them now, most African countries need a lot more in terms of childcare facilities for working mothers. So all of these things that in my country, the United States, we were fighting for in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, we need to fight harder for those in Africa and South Asia.
I would agree that it's really thinking about some of those policies in terms of discrimination. But I think, as Penny said, we still deal a little bit with that here even in Australia. But I'm wondering if mentoring programs, if there's something like that could be helpful in helping young women that are ready to enter the workforce. If there's, again, that would be a decision at a much more macro policy level, or maybe a middle policy level, but mentors who can encourage younger women to follow in their footsteps into the workplace, because we really need to get the amazingly talented people waiting involved.
Yeah, it's bottom up and it's top down as well.
Yeah, and women themselves playing a role in helping bring younger women through, which doesn't always necessarily happen. I think it was Madeleine Albright has this amazing, funny quote about there's a special place in hell for women who don't help women.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to use that. That's great. Anyone else like to ask a question? This one down the front here. Hello.
I was wondering, what can be done? Like, we have companies that have, like, Victoria's Secret has this thing called a Sumangali
scheme. Sumangali means married woman, and so you've got girls as young as 14 working so that their parents can have enough money for a dowry to get married. So you've got companies who are also playing into this thing, and there should be ways that we can target them.
Look at that controversy about Nike a couple of years ago. Thoughts on that?
Well, that was happening in Pakistan, in fact, child labor for making footballs. And we also had the issue of child labor out in the cotton fields because the big companies want to hire women and children, especially girls, because their fingers are thought to be more delicate for picking the cotton. And there was a huge successful advocacy with a big international company called IKEA. I don't know if you have that in Australia. You do? Yeah. And, well, okay, obviously everybody's houses are furnished with IKEA, yeah. So IKEA was buying a lot of this cotton in Pakistan, and when their awareness was raised about this issue, they've now invested really, really heavily in programs in Pakistan and in India to make sure that families are having alternatives in terms of school and also economic alternatives so that they don't have those children out in the cotton fields picking IKEA cotton and so that the children instead are in school, and that's with IKEA money. So corporate social responsibility can be a really powerful force, but it's up to all of you to raise the awareness about that.
When you say IKEA became aware, how did IKEA become aware? Was there, were there protests? Was there a story about it? A journalist did an expose, or?
It was actually, I mean, they have a strong corporate social responsibility program, and they were looking around for ways that they could implement that corporate social responsibility program. And in fact, many large corporations today have those kinds of programs, and the most helpful thing that we can do in many cases is just to come to them with a program and say, here's what you can do about it, and here's how you can be effective. And that's what happened with IKEA. They were looking around. They didn't have the experience of working in the less developed countries, and they didn't necessarily understand the local culture. So they were looking for a local partner who could tell them how they could make a difference.
Okay. Ladies, any other thoughts on corporations?
I think we see that much more in the US than we do in Australia for all sorts of reasons, but there's some really big companies like Goldman Sachs and their 1,000 girls, and there's some really big companies that have taken on girls as really a focus of their corporate social responsibility, and it's some of that, as you said, has been through pressure, and some of that's because they believe in the argument because they've kind of had the case made to them. I don't think that we are as active here in actually looking to the private sector to do those sorts of positive things. It's just not where we kind of work. We might sort of protest against them if they do things that we think are wrong, but we don't actually see them so much as taking a sort of leading role in driving campaigns.
Actually, I'd like to ask Maddie about this one. As a young person, is your generation much more active in, say, boycotting a company? For example, if you heard that IKEA was using these young people to...
Yeah.
I just get a sense that your generation's much more active about protesting and boycotting companies.
Definitely, and with social media especially, like if you remember the Coney 2012 a few months ago, as soon as people heard about that my age, it was all over Facebook, all over Twitter, everywhere. So I think once this generation hears about injustices and different things, especially with girls' education and child marriage, that, you know, it can become and it can spread a lot quicker through social media and Facebook and Twitter.
That's it, guys. Get tweeting on it. Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Thanks. For Penny, how well resourced is AusAid? And if it's not, I'm not sure how well resourced. The second part of the question is that indicative of, you know, our government's will?
I should say to start with, I don't actually work for AusAid. I work for the Department of Foreign... This is very arcane Canberra bureaucracy, but just to explain it, I work for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm what they call a career diplomat. So AusAid, the aid agency, is in our same portfolio working to the same minister. So I work with in foreign policy and the aid program, and I also work for the Office for Women. And can I say that in terms of aid, Australia has made a commitment to increase its aid significantly over the next couple of years. So in terms of the resources, it really has increased its resources. But more importantly, they undertook a review of aid effectiveness coming up to 2 years ago now, to actually look at, you know, the delivery of the aid program. And one of the key outcomes from that was the importance of having women and girls as a cross-cutting theme. And it also recognised that just mainstreaming issues around gender is not enough. You actually have to have specific interventions at certain points as well. So to answer your question, yes, there's an absolute commitment to the aid program. And if you, even in the last couple of months, if you kind of look at the narrative, if you just, you know, if you're bored one day, just go into Senator Carr's website and you can see a narrative since he's taken up the position as well, where, you know, he's doubled the commitment to aid money going to family planning to $50 million, initiated a program on violence in Cambodia, increased, I think it went $17 million pledged for women in Afghanistan. So there's also a narrative through the aid program that you can actually see, which I have a sense that there's a high level, there is a high level political commitment. And also the establishment of my position in itself was sort of the next step on from the review of aid effectiveness and the commitment to growing the funds. There was also a sense of, partly driven by civil society, well, why don't we have a diplomatic position that engages around the policy issues with other governments and also advocates for including women and girls at the centre of our aid program.
Okay, sorry. Do you have a percentage of GNP?
I think it's going up to 3.5 GNI.
Just on the back of that question, before we get to some other questions, I'm going to use this as an opportunity, Penny, to ask you a very controversial question. But I do a lot of work in talkback radio, and every time the aid budget is increased, you get a large sector of the community calling up and saying, why do we help people overseas? We should help our own first. What's your answer to that?
And that, you know, that's a natural reaction, and even around on issues that have an impact on women, I can understand completely when you look at Indigenous communities and you also look at services, you know, services in remote area to women, and it kind of seems $320 million and, you know, we don't have a refuge here. I can see why people ask those sorts of questions, but it's the right thing to do. It's absolutely the right thing to do. And these are relatively small amounts of money when you think about it in the grand scheme of it. I mean, we have an aid program to PNG that's like $500 million, $500 million a year. That's a significant aid program. I think the Canberra Hospital probably has a budget larger than that. If you actually put it in perspective about, yes, we're significantly increasing our aid, yes, we are making these contributions, but that doesn't, relative to what's kind of in the budget. I guess the other thing is that, as a foreign policy person, you would also make those arguments about the security of your region, the stability of your region. I mean, a country like Pakistan is obvious in terms of ensuring the eradication of poverty leads to a whole lot of factors around security and stability of that region.
And educating the children.
I've done quite a bit of research on Australia's education policy and AusAid's sort of developing policy in education. And I would think that from a policy perspective, definitely, AusAid has sort of reiterated the fact that it's being a good global citizen. The number of international compacts that AusAid has sort of signed on to or become members of, FTI, which is not the Fast Track Initiative anymore, it's the Global Education Initiative, but also the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies. I mean, those are just two examples in the field of education, I think, where AusAid feels that it has a voice, I guess, to contribute, and so that contribution, I guess, to global policy as well, being a, quote, good global citizen, as well as it's in the national interest kind of policy speak, is an important point for
It's important in
AusAid.
so many areas, isn't it?
Yeah.
I agree. Quite a few questions. There's a microphone down there, so I'll go there first, then I'll go up here, then I'll go over here. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm from Girl Guides Australia, and we know the importance of intergenerational leadership and role models. I know that there are a lot of young women here tonight, and I was interested whether anyone on the panel has some advice for Australian young women who are interested in empowering others.
I'm a great supporter of the Girl Guides. I'm a guide mother, I should admit. And I always say to the head of the Girl Guides, this is my first of my children to join the Girl Guides, and I did kind of have the idea that perhaps it was a paramilitary organisation. But then I realised that, in fact, that they just do this amazing work around the empowering of young women, particularly around body image. And I've been really happy to work with the guides. It doesn't matter where I am, suddenly there's Australian guides who pop up. I was at Rio +20 and Australian guides are there because Guides has this fantastic thing about getting young women involved in the world and decision making. So I think that when we think about the sorts of things that people can get involved in or young women can get involved in, there's all sorts of organisations, and Girl Guides is YWCA does an amazing thing in terms of young women's leadership in the Pacific as well. And I've been really happy to talk to the Girl Guides about what they're doing in the Pacific and some of that sort of mentoring work. So she's not a plant, but I do always do. Whenever I talk about girls and young women, I always do a plug for the Girl Guides. They really do exceptional work.
I was also a Boy Scout and Girl Scout mom. And when my children were really little, I said to my husband, we're not going to be sexist. I'll do the Boy Scouts and you do the Girl Scouts. Let's set an example here. I lasted through one Cub Scout meeting, and I came home and told my husband, you are doing the boys. but I would say join, especially to the girls, but to the guys too. Be a joiner. Don't be a video game addict necessarily. Be a joiner. Because really empowerment comes through being part of a team, through being part of a group, and rising up to leadership within, whether it's a small club or a small group. It offers those leadership opportunities that can be so empowering. And as Maddie said, the story that she read, change yourself to be a joiner, to be part of some kind of community organization, and that community organization becomes part of something of your community, of your nation, of the world.
Sorry, you?
I was also a Girl Scout, so I can just back but I'll let Maddie go.
I can really speak to that too. Being someone who, didn't really know how to get involved, coming to Youth PACT, Youth Planning a Change Today, I really found that I can make a difference. And as I said before, I'm only 15 sitting up here speaking to all of you, and it's just massively life-changing. So if you do want to get involved, boys and girls with Youth PACT, you can Facebook it or Google it, and I think there's flyers from the plant staff too, so.
I think I said I was going to go up there next time, and that's where the microphone is, and then I'll come down here. So sorry.
Personally, I'm quite passionate about the environment. So going back to the actual issue of educating them, I was wondering how much is the sustainable and environmental issues in building the schools and, the uniforms, how are they factored into the education? Like, can we continue this and keep, the most long-lasting, most environmentally sound way to build and educate these girls?
That's something that's definitely taken into plans as we build more and more schools. I probably can't talk specifically about environmental construction techniques, but I do know that as sort of schools are built, that is sort of being an environmentally responsible school is important. When I was in Vanuatu, I talked to a person from Live and Learn, which is an NGO based in Australia, but but this was the Vanuatu branch of Live and Learn. And they were doing some really incredible work in terms of environmental education in the primary years, and also working with local communities who are very linked to the environment. Their livelihood depends on the environment as well. I just had another point about the environment that I can't remember. Yes, and there's another in Vanuatu, Penny may know the organization, One Small Bag, that does a lot of community education activities, goes to a lot of the outer islands, and this is adult education. So I guess helping people, One Small Bag is, through drama and sort of community theater, making people aware of specific issues with the environment. So certainly at an NGO level, like environmental education, learning about the environment, how to preserve it in a place is very important. But I think that socially responsible, environmentally responsible construction is certainly something, when contractors come in to build schools, is something that would be in their plans.
UNICEF has really strict rules about environmental impact assessments for all of the school and health center construction that we do. And I think most overseas development assistants insist on that. But I'd like to follow up Elizabeth, because I think just as important as environmentally sound construction is, schools as centers and agents of change can be really, really important. In Pakistan, for instance, we have all these, again, be a joiner, all these environmental clubs that we encourage children to join. And whether it's about planting trees or cleaning up dirty, stagnant water, getting the canals running again, or in Pakistan, we have 40 million people who defecate in the open. It's a major environmental problem. It's a major cause of health problems in Pakistan. And we have these young champions, sanitation champions, who go around to the different villages and they make little clay models, copying exactly what they see in the villages. And then they say, look, I've made a model of your house, and look how the people and the animals have left their feces here. And here I've made another model of your house, and here's what it could look like. And so we get these school children who themselves make sure that their school environment is clean, and they belong to these clubs that then it goes out, it expands out from the school to the villages, to the places they live, working in a very practical way on a clean environment.
Gee, that's clever.
I just wanted to make a point about the environment as it relates to decision making. So when we talk about women's political empowerment, we're not just talking about increasing the number of women in national parliaments, although obviously that's a goal too. It's also just increasing the number of women, young women and girls who participate in decision-making processes, and some of the most crucial of those are water committees. They're actually committees that are making decisions about the distribution of water, the handling of water, or decisions around village committees about the local environment. So those are really actually critical environmental forums that we want women to be able to be in a position that they can contribute, because we know the sort of positive bearing that they'll bring into those communities.
Terrific. I think there were a couple of questions. This lady down the front, yes?
I used to be a girl guide. And,
Me too.
And then I became Director of Anti-Slavery Australia. I'm Jennifer Byrne. And I just wanted to say to everybody that we have had a real focus on Australia's domestic response, particularly in the area of forced marriage lately. And if you're interested in finding out more about this and looking at trafficking and slavery in Australia, then look us up on the web, Anti-Slavery Australia. But then additionally, we all have an opportunity that we've never had before, which is that the Australian government has convened an inquiry into slavery. So for another week or two, we have an opportunity to write to the Australian Parliament and say we are concerned about early and forced marriage. We're concerned about the Millennium Development Goals, the adequacy of aid programs, and we want to encourage the Australian government to develop best practices, both domestically and internationally. So it can just be a simple one-page letter. If there's one thing that you care about tonight, maybe it's the Millennium Development Goals, maybe it's something to do with early and child marriage, maybe it's looking at corporate social responsibility. Write to the Senate, to the Parliamentary Committee. If you're not sure, give us a call at Anti-Slavery Australia.
Thank you. That's a great call to action and a good reminder for all of us.
Jennifer does an amazing job, and since I've been in this role, she's taught me, she got me early, so she's a really good example of a very effective advocate. But my role, the intention is to work with civil society, and is to kind of capture those views, and it is to be much more of, this sounds idealistic, but it is to be much more of a partnership rather than having that kind of, the us and them. So I've been really pleased to be able to work with Jennifer, including on some casework in relation to early enforcement.
Fabulous. Now, I feel like I've neglected this side, so perhaps this lady in the pink?
My question is about education. I work as a teacher. My question to the panel is, for people in developing countries, you've spoken about the constraints of where they go to be educated in terms of wanting to have a safe environment. But tangibly, what are people in developing countries, in terms of, say, curriculum, what are they looking for? What are the skills that they're wanting to see in their communities? I guess my thinking is then, for where they're educated in their village, for those that leave their village or have aspirations to leave and impact further than just their village, what are the people in villages wanting in terms of education for their village?
That's a very good question, and one that I probably won't be able to answer to your satisfaction. But first of all, I think it does depend on context. And a couple of weeks ago, someone said to me, they said, we were talking about education and linking it to the economy, which can be, a very effective way to get funding for something. But she said, do we always have to talk about dollars? Is education just for, is it just for a job, and what does it mean? And so in terms of a local curriculum, it depends very much on the context. In sort of, people are going to hate this in the development industry, we have been very guilty of sort of importing curriculums from Australia, importing not only Australia but many countries with aid programs, and giving them to an education system and then just expecting these to work. And so we seem to be stuck in a cycle of reforming again and again and again. So I guess a lot about making curriculum relevant is really working, and I'm not sure we've got there yet, but working effectively in partnership with communities. And a lot of that has to do, but as well, that everything is involved in these educational settings, not only the kids in the schools there, but also teachers, and what kind of teacher training and do teachers have access to, and does it help teachers to be critical thinkers and thinking of a new way to do things, because there's so much that happens in schools, as you would know, being a teacher, and where do we have, how do we let people have time to sort of upgrade their skills and adapt to new ways of thinking in a way that might be useful for their students? I'm not sure if that answered it specifically.
Now, I'm afraid time is against us. We've only got time for one more question. I have neglected this side, so there's a man with his hand thrust in the air. Yes.
My question is to you, Karen. With your experience in Pakistan, have you...
Sorry, can you speak a little bit louder?
With your experience living in Pakistan, have you seen a change in perception of women by men who live in the city versus the... So the question is, with your experience living in Pakistan, have you seen a perception of men towards women changing if they live in the city versus in rural Pakistan? Because for a Pakistani, I've never been in a village myself, so have you seen kind of, because in the city you would have met people who are middle class and upper middle class, and in the rural villages you would have just seen poor people, so is there a change in perception?
Which city in Pakistan?
Karachi or Lahore?
Karachi, okay. I was going to talk about Karachi. Karachi is a mega city of at least 18 million people. And so the answer is yes, but a qualified yes. Because, for instance, it is a fact that a girl from the upper income quintile in a city in Pakistan actually has a higher than average rate of educational attainment compared to the national average, and even slightly higher than boys. So being in an urban area and being from we're not talking about rich, we're talking about just, as you said, just the middle class that can afford the school. It makes a huge difference, and it's just a sea shift in attitude. On the other hand, big mega cities in South Asia are also filling up with so many extremely poor, conservative, traditional, and even violent people who have come from rural areas for various reasons. And so some areas of Karachi are actually more traditional and even more violent than the rural areas. So it's really important that our development efforts now focus on the fact that developing countries are rapidly urbanizing. And while there's big opportunities there for girls and women, there's also risks and dangers there.
Yeah. There's the other side of the coin, isn't there? We do have a few more minutes just for some closing comments, I guess. First of all, Maddie, I'd like to start with you. Where do you see us going from here? What is the most important point for our audience to take away with them tonight?
Yeah. So each person here has amazing potential, and each person, as you've seen on the panel, has unique perspective and unique skills to share. If we use these things and work together, we can help girls and women to break the chains of intergenerational poverty and inequity.
Wonderful, well said and eloquently put. Penny, what one message would you like the audience to take away?
I think the statistics that you could take away that there's these horrifying statistics, but I think you should take away a sense of optimism, that there's some real momentum around the world at a global political level. The Secretary of State in the US has really driven some. We've seen some movement in the Pacific Island Forum. So I think you should take away a sense of optimism, but I think you should also take away a sense of optimism because of the role of women themselves, and particularly in the Pacific. We need to be listening to those women and those young women and those girls and be led by them to a certain extent. So, take away a sense of optimism rather than it's all doom and gloom, because the statistics are pretty daunting.
And yet there have been some inspiring stories and examples tonight. Elizabeth, a take-home message and a call to action. What can people do to help?
A colleague of mine in the Faculty of Education co-teach an undergraduate unit called Global Poverty and Education, and because we're academics, we want people to think critically and not, about all sorts of things, especially education. And we were in a tutorial yesterday and talking about something, and students were like, oh gosh, there's nothing we can do. And both of us looked at each other and we said, oh no, what have we done? But we wanted students to believe it is very complex and there are things we can do. I mean, we're very dedicated to sort of contributing to working with people in other countries. And for me, that's education is really the sector that sort of grounds everything. So think about education if you're going to join. I think it's take-home message. It's not, and again, I would back up Penny, it's not all gloom and doom. It's, there is a lot we can contribute, and I think particularly through partnerships, through listening to each other, and I'll leave it at that.
Well put. Yeah. Karen?
Well, I assume everybody is here because they're interested in gender equality. I would say that move yourselves from being interested in gender equality to being a gender equality champion. And it's not a hard thing to do. It means that you make it part of your thinking, your everyday life, and that you bring up the issue, you're aware of the issues, you say or do something about the issues. And there's two ways to do that. One is with your head and one is with your hearts. We need evidence-based advocacy, so it's important that you do a bit of work to research it and to know some of the statistics, and importantly, some of the things that make a difference, the lessons learned. But it's also important to put your heart and soul in it and really believe in it, because that, just as much as the statistics, will communicate to people and make people change.
Okay, beautifully put. Well, thank you so much for coming along to the 57th One Just World Forum, and I'm sure you'll leave here tonight with a deeper understanding of the issues in all the countries that these women have worked in so tirelessly, with their incredible wise words, and also with a sense of inspiration from what they've just said here, and a sense of inspiration in the next generation with what Maddie's been able to share with us as well. They are extraordinary women and girl. I include you in women, you know. Please give them a round of applause. Now, I've just got a couple of final messages. You can check out the video of tonight's forum, Isn't Technology Wonderful, on the One Just World website. Keep tweeting at 1JW. The winner of tonight's best tweet is at Madeline Hollins. So congratulations, you get that $50 voucher. Awesome. You can get your prize from the World Vision table outside. And you can also follow One Just World on Facebook, where a discussion on the role of men, corporate social responsibility, and us in empowering girls to change the world will start shortly. That's facebook.com/onejustworld. And before you leave, please have a chat with some of the people at the tables outside. They'll give you some tips on how you can get involved. And I'm sure you all want to, because you're here tonight and that is just tremendous. So thank you so much for coming along. Please fill out an evaluation form on your way out as well and hand it to one of our volunteers. Thank you so much for coming along. Enjoy the rest of your night.